By the end of the 1920s, the Soviet Navy needed the construction of new cruisers, as the Imperial cruisers were certainly becoming old, even by Soviet standards. Even the Krasnyi Krym, as their design was a bit outdated. So the Soviets, through the efforts of the Red Navy and Italian yards, came up with Project 26 and a further evolution of that design, what eventually became the Kirov-class of light cruisers, not quite heavy cruisers, as we'll soon see. Regardless, this class of ships was the largest the Soviets built during this period. Like our video on the Leningrad-class flotilla leaders, there were some serious issues with the design and the construction of these vessels. In today's video, we'll go into the design and the issues this interesting class of cruisers had. Our story begins in the late 1920s with Soviet naval personnel wanting to create new ships, especially cruisers, as they couldn't compete with their existing fleet of Imperial-era ships. Those wanting to create new cruisers advocated for it in 1931 for the next Soviet 5-year plan, with a group of Baltic Works naval engineers writing a letter to the naval leadership advocating for naval capital ship construction, making the point that the development of relevant facilities and design skills was necessary for this purpose. Cruiser construction, along with other parts of the fleet, were being discussed as a part of the 1932 to 1935 5-year plan, a complex plan for the Soviet Navy intended for all 4 major fleet areas and included coastal defenses and naval aviation. 4 new cruisers were to be included in this plan. Accordingly, such a program was going to be costly, around 1.4 billion rubles, something that made the State Planning Commission and other parts of the government blush and deny the Navy these ambitious plans. Although some construction was authorized, including the reactivation of the damaged battleship Fruns, the ex-Poltava, something that didn't come to fruition. Hey folks, really quick here, I just wanted to give a shout out to my second channel, Unimportant History, as we're going to be covering some really interesting topics on that other channel. We started off with Syrian Panzer IVs, and in this week's edition, we're going to be talking about Ripcord T-34s from the Civil War in Yemen. Talks continued about Soviet naval expansion throughout the 1930s, with the proposed naval plans including battleships, battlecruisers, aircraft carriers, heavy and light cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and all other manner of craft. Granted, these plans were a bit ambitious with the state of the Soviet shipbuilding industry. The more ambitious plans were not approved by the Communist Party Central Committee or by the Defense Committee, an organization that would replace the Council of Labor and Defense in early 1937. However, the Navy drafted a less ambitious plan in early 1938, including the 6 initial ships of Project 26, our Kirov-class cruisers, something that had started beforehand. There were design studies that had been taken up earlier in the decade. They were akin to battlecruisers with their size, but taking from Christopher Wright in his section in Warships International, Volume 45, Cruisers of the Soviet Navy Part 2, Project 26, and Project 26 BIS, the Kirov-class. Understanding the sequence of events in the design of Project 26 is facilitated by an understanding of the evolution of the organization and responsibilities of the Navy officers and industrial management agencies involved. The Navy identified military capability goals and priorities and design features. The State Industrial Authority controlled and directed the shipyards and their associated design bureaus, which prepared construction drawings. The 2 establishments worked together to create the naval ship forces of the USSR. The 2 organizations worked hand in hand, sort of, to work out Project 26 with some hiccups in new organizations and with them foreign assistance. As we've discussed previously, the Soviet Union was not a stranger to working with foreign shipyards for help with their designs, material, construction, etc., with the Soviet battle carrier hybrid coming to mind as Gibbs & Cox, an American firm, helped to design it. For the Soviets, though, they had worked heavily with the German Army and Air Forces throughout the 1920s and 30s, and you'd think they'd work together with the German Navy, with the Soviet Commission being allowed to tour the new Deutschland when she launched in the early 1930s. However, the Germans were less than willing to share technical knowledge with the Soviets on naval matters, so the Soviets focused their efforts on another nation whose ideology at the time would make you think that they wouldn't want to work together: Italy. Italian and Soviet relations had been quite good, starting in the 1920s, the Italian desire for Russian food products and the Soviets looking for Italian manufactured goods. Soviet ships had even made calls to Italian ports in the 1920s, with the Italians and Soviets starting to work together during these visits in the late 1920s. For our purposes, things get interesting in 1932, when again taking from right, the Italians refused to sell an existing cruiser to the Soviets, but in any case, the Soviets preferred to build the ships domestically because they could not afford to buy such a large ship from a foreign firm. Accordingly, the new Soviet Navy commander, V.M. Orlov, proposed in a letter of January 12, 1932, to the Gosplan president, K.E. Voroshilov, to order 1 or 2 new cruisers from Italy for construction in Russia, with Italian assistance. Orlov considered the Italian Condottieri-type cruiser design to be the most suitable for the Russian Navy. He states that one such ship could be built in the USSR with Italian support for 14 million rubles, or 2 for a total of 25 million rubles. The Italians were bound to contemporary international arms limitation treaties concerning ship design and could not build ships either for themselves or for foreign customers that violated treaty provisions. So the Soviets were going to work with the Italians on these new cruisers, something akin to the destroyer leader Tashkent, and more specifically, they were going to work with the Ansaldo yard. So with this in mind, in Soviet planning to build cruisers during the second 5-year plan, on April 15, 1932, the Naval Forces Chief, V.M. Orlov, approved the proposed operational tactics tasks for the new light cruisers of 6,000-ton displacement that had been forwarded by the head of the training service commander of the Navy. The ships were to perform these roles: 1. Supporting submarine operations at their bases and sea. 2. Reconnaissance support for reconnaissance and destroyer attacks. 3. Support or repel amphibious landings. 4. Taking part in combined forces attack at sea and against shore targets. 5. Combat against enemy cruisers. Throughout this time, the development of the weaponry, machinery, and other aspects of the ship were being worked out. The initial plans for 152mm guns weren't going to plan, as they were older Imperial-era weaponry, and further development was somewhat difficult. However, the development of the 180mm 7.1-inch guns were going well, and what was going to be the main battery of these cruisers, and further Soviet commissions were going to Italy to learn about the construction of these vessels and even purchase equipment, as in mid-1932, placing an order for propulsion machinery comprising of boilers and turbines capable of generating 100,000 to 125,000 shaft horsepower, and hopefully solve the issue of delays and defects in home-built turbines, i.e. those Leningrad-class turbines, and through continued talks and negotiations, the Ansaldo yard agreed to give the already constructed machinery for the future Eugenio di Savoia and further technical support for 5 years. So, for those wanting me to make it obvious, these Kirov-class cruisers, with some exceptions, followed along similar lines to Italian light cruisers, something that is evident by their hull lines and machinery, as we've discussed. However, I think Wright puts it best. Adoption of Eugenio di Savoia type machinery in a hull otherwise similar to the earlier Raimondo Montecuccoli introduced a challenge that required improvisation. Through the various changes in the design between the Ansaldo team and Soviet designers from TS, KS, BS1, there were serious discrepancies in their weight figures with additions that we'll get into in a bit. Still, for example, Kirov was 890 tons overweight on her trials, and at full load displacement, she was 636 tons overweight. Throughout the 1930s, various Soviet dockyards were allocated to build these vessels. Baltic Shipyard would build 2 ships. The first was laid down in 1935 and a second in 1936. Nikolaev was to build 4 ships, the first 2 in 1935 and the second 2 in 1936. And finally, we come to a Russian word that I simply can't pronounce. I'll put it up on screen now. A new shipyard would build the 2 for the Pacific. Granted, this was all subject to change depending on the speed of the building of the different ships, but generally they would stay in the same areas. But we'll get back to that in a second. We should probably describe the cruisers, as I'm sure that's probably what most of you are here for. As I mentioned before, the hull layout was similar to that of the Condottieri-class light cruisers and similar to the Montecuccoli-class, with changes to accommodate for the machinery, and the Kirovs were slightly larger forward to accommodate for the main battery, and a large superstructure, along with the Russian design, being slightly further aft, with a transom stern, though only having one large gun aft in place of two lighter gun turrets. The ships were primarily riveted, but were welded in non-critical structures. The ship's hulls were subdivided into 19 watertight compartments for enhanced survivability. This design was foreseen to keep the ship afloat and upright even with 3 adjacent compartments flooded, something that did prove useful. Now, the main battery was certainly interesting, and something that wasn't seen in other naval powers. A 180mm 7.1-inch weapon, something similar had been installed in the previous Russian and Soviet cruisers. However, the Kirovs would be getting the 180mm 57 caliber B1P weapons, which had slight modifications compared to the previous weapons, and there would be 9 arranged in 3 turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. Proved to be a less than favorable arrangement for the guns. The ships had a secondary battery of 100mm guns in single turret arrangements, as seen by this picture, as well as 2 triple torpedo launchers, 1 per side. Of course, they did have a smattering of different anti-aircraft guns throughout their careers, as with other ships we've discussed. For their protection, Project 26 ships had a 50mm belt, a 50mm deck, and a bridge of 150mm, and the turrets had a face thickness of 50mm. The cruisers had plenty of upgrades throughout their career, including sonar, radar, and other equipment. For some more details, I'll put up a table found in Soviet cruisers 1917 to 1945 from the October Revolution to World War II by Alexander Hill, which illustrates the details a bit better. The construction of the ships was carried out in due time. Key components for all the ships of the class were efficiently divided up by allocating orders for common items at single enterprises. While economically efficient, it caused problems creating single points of failure, where all ships might be held up by delay at one factory supporting all shipbuilding yards. Thus, all turbine reduction gears came from Kharkov, the turbine assemblies from another plant, and most of the armor from Izora, and so on. As we've talked about earlier, the cruisers were being laid down, and the ones in the Baltic, particularly the Kirov, were coming along by January 1937. We're taking from right again. In January 1937, Flagman, 2nd rank, I.M. Galler, commander of the Red Baltic Fleet, visited the cruiser Kirov under construction in the Baltic Yard and raised a question concerning the rearrangements of its conning tower and navigation bridge work, among other things. Subsequently, a senior naval staff officer, Engineer Flagman, 2nd rank, a Russian name I can't pronounce but it's up on screen now, reported to the Naval Forces Commander V.M. Orlov that the arrangements of the command facilities of the cruisers required alterations. The quadruple mast forward obscured the field of view from the conning tower aft and also restricted the coverage of the forward searchlights and 45mm semi-automatic gun batteries forward. It's safe to say the officers of the Navy had some changes they'd like to make to the ships. Construction of the first 2 ships was so far along that it was decided to continue them as they were. The decision to change the design of the latter ships was taken up in April of 1937, and thus the creation of Project 26 BIS or BIS was undertaken. The basic hull, machinery, and armament was unchanged from Project 26. Armor protection was increased in the side belt, transverse bulkheads, and on the front plates and roofs of the main battery turrets to 70mm. The number of small caliber guns, 45mm anti-aircraft guns, was increased to 9. The foremast structure was altered significantly, reduced in height, and rearranged for greater visibility. More modern fire control systems were installed, and aircraft catapults of domestic design were incorporated. Wooden furniture was replaced by metal, aluminum furniture. Normal displacement was increased to 8,882 tons, at a mean draft of 5.87 meters. There were 2 ships built to these specifications, the ones in the Black Sea and a further 2 in the Pacific, with some adjustments to those ships as seen in the table we saw earlier. Still, I'll bring it up on screen once again, but I'll also throw in some from warships of the Soviet fleet. Up until this point, I've been avoiding saying the names of the ships because they changed quite a bit throughout their careers. However, at the start of their careers, they were Kirov, Voroshilov, Maxim Gorky, Molotov, Kalinin, and Kagnovich. We could get into their careers a bit, but let's be honest, Soviet ships didn't do a ton in the Second World War, Winter War, and Continuation War. They provided gunfire support on the coast in the Baltic and the Black Seas. The Black Sea ships Molotov and Voroshilov did more, running back and forth from Sevastopol, with Molotov having her stern blown off. Still, it was replaced by one from a Chapayev-class cruiser, Fruns, another class of ship we'll discuss at some point. And the cruisers in the Pacific didn't get up to much. During the war and post, they had many refits and upgrades and were slowly phased out, with most of them being scrapped from the late 1950s up until the 1970s. What I'm sure you'd like me to talk about at this point is what made the ships poor, and there's quite a bit. The first issue up on the list is the fact that the ships were overweight, some by quite a lot like Kirov, being close to 900 tons overweight when she was complete. They tried to deal with those issues through the use of lighter alloys like aluminum alloys for the ladders, partitions, and ventilation ducts. Despite this, she was still overweight. The ships being overweight was in part due to the large superstructures as compared to their Italian cousins in the Condottieri-class. Yes, I do understand that it's not the real name of the classes, it's a historical term, so meh to Italian viewers. Along with that, the turrets being rather large and heavy due to the triple gun arrangement. All of this also reduced the stability of the ships as well as their speeds as compared to their design specifications. Something that went hand in hand with those problems was their seakeeping. Being based on the Condottieri-class, they had fine lines being built for speed, with some of the Italian ships achieving 42 knots on trials, an extremely impressive feat. All of that was fine and dandy in the relative calm of the Mediterranean. However, when the Kirov ships entered service, being of a similar design, the ships had poor performance in adverse weather conditions found in northern Russia, rolling excessively, limiting their operational flexibility in the Baltic. I'm sure some of you raised an eyebrow when you were looking at the tables for their armor being so thin around the belt, especially the Project 26 cruisers. However, that goes back to their Italian heritage, as those Condottieri-class cruisers had even thinner belt armor, being 18 to 24 millimeters. The armor scheme of the Kirovs was thin, with a comparable armor scheme being the Königsberg-class of Germany, and those were restricted due to the Treaty of Versailles. So with that, the cruiser's protection couldn't withstand anything bigger than destroyer-caliber weapons. Project 26 BIS was somewhat better with their 70 millimeters of armor, but overall thin compared to other ships of the period. The Project 26 cruisers also had problems with their fire control systems being underdeveloped, causing the ships to be short-ranged and inaccurate, and radar was not fitted until later in the war. As a consequence, accuracy was poor, especially at longer ranges, and reduced effectiveness against both surface and air targets. Of course, one of the most famous problems was their turrets. They were extremely cramped due to the addition of the third gun, causing the rate of fire to be sometimes as slow as 2 rounds a minute. Some sources give other numbers, but generally speaking, the rate of fire was more akin to a battleship. Granted, Major Sharp would approve of the soldiery, but when it comes to a light cruiser of the Second World War, that wasn't great. Another issue with these vessels, as with some of the other ones, relates to the inconsistency of the machinery due to issues with Soviet craftsmanship. With the machinery based on the ones found in the Eugenio di Savoia, the Soviets found difficulties in reproducing the systems to scale, with turbines and boilers prone to failure, with many of the cruisers never achieving their intended top speed. Finally, the conditions of the cruisers weren't great, as Italian designs were generally cramped and the ships were uncomfortable for the crews, with ventilation and heating being quite poor. Additionally, the aluminum furniture most likely wasn't the most comfortable either for the crews. For the most part, the issues with the cruisers were due to their shortcomings in the Soviet industry, and I think considering the conditions that we described in the Leningrad-class videos about the quality of Soviet ship construction, it's understandable the ships had issues. Maybe in a future video, we'll take a look at their predecessors and their problems. Soviet ship history is some of my favorite to deal with, and hopefully you guys as well. In any case, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.